Thank you very much for your attention. Now we turn to the interactive panel. Once again, for those in attendance, again, I mentioned that we recognize a great number of colleagues in the room. Our friend Mikola is taking the names of the delegations who would like to speak at the end. We do encourage everybody to have a word, and we are very grateful for your attendance here today. With that said, we will move on to the theme of today's assembly, not just the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, but to realize that that sad event concentrated on the weaponization of food. So to speak to that, we have two speakers available to us electronically on the screen, as well as one on the panel. Our first speaker to speak on the weaponization of food then and now and ensuring the right to food to all is Ms. Tetiana Soproniuk of the University of Cambridge. For those looking for a longer explanation, we do have a QR code, as is protocol here, to explain everybody's biography. Ms. Tatiana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. What I want to speak about is perhaps the classic example of Soviet genocide, its longest and broadest experiment in Russification, the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. These words belong to Raphael Lemkin, a worldwide known international lawyer who coined the term genocide and was the father of the UN Genocide Convention. 70 years ago, in 1953, he spoke at the Holodomor commemoration event in New York City and explained why the Soviet policy towards Ukraine is genocidal. The most terrible weapon used against Ukrainians was starvation, deliberately organized and perpetuated by Joseph Stalin and his supporters. This artificial famine is now known as the Holodomor, the term that means killing by starvation or mass mortality from famine. In 1932 and 1933, at least 3.9 million people in Ukraine were starved to death for their nationality, language, identity, and their denial to follow the totalitarian machine which forcibly led everyone to the bright communist future through blood and torture. In 1929, Soviet government proclaimed the policy of total collectivization. Private, individual farms were reorganized into the collective farms, so-called kolkhozes. In theory, people were expected to willingly surrender all their land, cattle, agricultural tools, to work collectively and then to distribute the produce among those who were working. In fact, the real motivation for such a policy was to turn independent farmers into the obedient crowd and to pump out as much grain as possible to feed the growing needs of industrialization. This policy, along with other decisions of the Soviet government, was met with strong resistance. In the early 1930s, more than 4,000 uprisings and rebellions took place in Ukraine, participated by more than 1 million people. Although this resistance was not systematic, it posed a serious danger to the regime because it could eventually lead to Ukraine becoming independent. The resistance were branded as kulaks, kurkuls, enemies of the state, and imprisoned or exiled to Siberia or other remote parts of the Soviet Union. But this was not enough. The Bolsheviks wanted to break the spine of the Ukrainian nation. In 1932, the Soviet government imposed an unrealistic grain quota for Ukraine. The system of grain quotas, which are also known as grain procurement plans, meant that the farmers had to hand over an assigned amount of produce to the state before they could have anything for themselves. When a village failed to meet the quota, a special patrol brigade came there and confiscated all the grain farmers had in their possession. Very soon, so-called food fines were introduced, and the brigades became able to confiscate, for example, potatoes and meat and other food products. They searched people's houses and took away everything edible they could find. Many people were trying to survive by collecting the crop residues from the fields. However, on the 7th of August of 1932, the so-called 5 stocks of grain law was adopted. According to it, anyone caught taking any produce, even a few stalks of grain, from a collective field, could be shot or imprisoned for 10 years for stealing the so-called socialist property. Another way to survive was to go to Russia or to Belarus and exchange one's clothes or family jewelry for food. To prevent this, the authorities forbade the peasants to leave the country and buy the tickets for water and railway transport. Millions of starving people in Ukraine were effectively incarcerated. Many peasants tried to get to the cities and beg for food or find a job there. To do this, they had to have a special identity document, a passport, signed by their local village authority. Since it was almost impossible to get such a document, the peasants who came to the cities were often persecuted by police. And nonetheless, the most horrible measure imposed in 1932 was blackboards, also known as blacklists. The villages and whole districts, which despite all the measures of Soviet authorities failed to meet the quota or was still resisting the regime, were blacklisted. They were surrounded by military units and all food was taken from their inhabitants. Trade was prohibited. All goods were removed from shops and the leadership of the village council, collective farm or party branch could be repressed. Residents of blacklisted villages were forbidden to leave the blocked territory. The regime was deliberately creating the conditions that were incompatible with life, conditions calculated to bring about physical destruction of the people. In general, during the Holodomor, hundreds of Ukrainian villages suffered from this regime. As a result, Ukraine was devastated. The peak of the famine was spring and summer of 1933. At that time, desperate people resorted to eating anything: grass, leaves, rotten vegetables, cats, dogs, rats, birds. Whole families, streets, and villages perished. Rotting corpses lay on streets for days, since there was no one to bury them. Often, the bodies were buried in mass graves, large pits on the outskirts of cities and villages, without coffins or any memorial signs. The communist regime did everything to keep these events in secret. Foreign journalists could not enter Ukraine freely and had to follow the routes assigned by the authorities. Many mass graves of the famine victims were destroyed and covered over by parks, schools, or residential houses. Speaking about the Holodomor in public could lead to imprisonment. Survivors were afraid to talk about their experience, even to their own children. At the same time, already in 1932 and 1933, due to the efforts of foreign journalists, diplomats, and Ukrainian communities abroad, the world was alerted of the scale of human suffering in Ukraine. Western media were publishing reports about the famine. Many organizations were raising money and sending food parcels, but this didn't make much difference. The League of Nations discussed the situation in the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic behind closed doors, but abstained from any decisions. The world remained blind to the suffering of millions. As we can see, the Holodomor is an example of weaponization of one of the most basic human needs, the need for food. Starving Ukrainians were dying in agony, while the Soviet Union was exporting grain. Those who survived were traumatized for the rest of their lives. Along with repressions against national elites and national church, the Holodomor eliminated the basis for the liberation movement and influenced the core identity of Ukrainians. Finally, those who organized the genocide of 1932 and 1933, and those who launched a full-scale war against Ukraine on the 24th of February of 2022, occupy the same offices of the Moscow Kremlin. Please remember, evil grows when unpunished. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Tetiana. Thank you for that wonderful information that many of us haven't heard put so eloquently as you did. So thank you for your participation today. The second half of our panel discussion will turn to this current century. As many of us gathered here in this room understand, it is not often that which we personally undergo that is most helpful for the world, but sharing our experiences and learning from each other.